Hello, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about Moon Knight episode 5, and let's just jump right into this because there's a lot I want to say. First off, it is my belief that this is 100% my favorite show that Marvel has ever put out that has existed within the MCU. Daredevil's probably still at the top of my list, but this one is a close second in terms of the overall Marvel property TV shows that exist out there, but it is definitely number one in the MCU. The story consistency over the last year of every single Marvel show has not been spot on until now. I mean, there has been no episode in this series that has felt like a waste of time in my mind, and every single piece that we've seen here has just added more and more to the intrigue and interest in the characters involved in this journey. To be honest, I wasn't expecting much from this show when I first started watching, but now I am super hyped for what this finale is going to have in store because I just love where they've taken this story so far, and this latest episode 100% has gone in such a different direction from anything I would have expected in the MCU, to the point where I am excited and intrigued and just hyped to see what is coming next within the MCU, regardless of whether or not, we get to see a ton of Stephen Grant or Marc Spector in the future. I think that this show is exactly what Marvel needed to bring back a lot of interest and to build back and show the world that there are new characters that you can really write well and not connect completely to the MCU right away, and yet still have a lot of interest and hype around the story, and that's exactly what's happened here. Honestly, the acting in this episode and the writing itself is just so well done, and it is the best thing that I've seen the MCU do in terms of their shows so far, and I'm super excited if this is an indicator of what we have left to see in other shows moving forward, whether it be like the She-Hulk series or with the new Miss Marvel show, all of that stuff. Like, if they continue this level of writing and really keeping it driven around the characters and have a compelling main lead and main characters around them, like, that is 100% going to make the future shows phenomenal, just as it's done for Moon Knight. Now, to get into actual specifics for this episode, let's talk about what I thought was one of the weirdest, most confusing parts of the episode, but also this isn't something that ever took anything away from the actual episode, but instead it made me want to think and understand more about what's actually going on, and that is, of course, everything with going back into the asylum. I decided to think of this as like a somewhat of a retreat into one's own asylum, one's own safe space type of thing, which is what I think that Marc and Steven are doing here. They don't explicitly tell us exactly what's happening, but I think it's pretty evident that every time one of them gets completely overwhelmed, they end up in this space that they've concocted in their brain, which I would surmise that it's still one shared area for the both of them, but it's like their place where they go to keep themselves protected in this situation where they're getting completely overwhelmed and they can no longer just shift who's in charge because they're both out and about, right? And I thought this was very interesting because it was weird, but also it seemed like a very clear defense mechanism that the two of them were using, and I really loved it. I'd also like to mention, in general, like everything that they did here with Taweret, as well as all of the like Egyptian mythology types of things that were going on in this episode, specifically with like the boat traveling across the sands, and I forget what they called them, but like the creatures that were then going to take Stephen and Marc to the sands for the rest of eternity if they could not balance their scales. And then also with the scales themselves, I suspected that we would see Anubis, but perhaps it's just my ignorance and not knowing too much about Egyptian mythology, but I thought it was Anubis that actually weighed the hearts on the scale. But instead, I mean, I think there was a statue of Anubis on the scale, so maybe that's just representative of that piece. But I'm not certain, since I'm not an aficionado in that particular type of mythology. I don't know too much of the specifics on that, so I just kind of took it as it was at that point. But more specifically with the actual environment, I mean, it was so well done. It looked very reminiscent to me of the ancestral plane, I believe is what it's called, the whole thing with where Bast is located and all of the ancestors of the Wakandans, of their like Black Panthers. I thought this was also interesting because Taweret does mention that the ancestral plane is kind of like something similar to this, where it's an afterlife that exists. So my curiosity is, how exactly do you end up at a particular afterlife, and does everyone go to an afterlife in the MCU? I mean, do the Asgardians actually go to Valhalla? So if something like Asgard has Valhalla, I mean, would we be able to see Odin? Would we be able to see Loki and all the dead Asgardians that have passed, that died specifically in battle, I believe, is what you have to do to end up in Valhalla. So maybe Odin doesn't really count, I don't know, but it would be very curious to see how that goes about and if they want to actually go that route. Regardless of what that world building element potentially is, which honestly that does get me pretty excited, the coloring and all of that stuff that goes on in this episode for this area just looks very, very cool. As I said, it was very similar to the ancestral plane, which is confirmed to be, another real thing that exists out there. It's just another type of afterlife that exists, which I really appreciate that in general, just like creating a bit of continuity in between everything, which I think is a good idea. Taweret herself is actually very, very well animated, which I was excited by because I knew in the previous episode she was done very well, but I mean, we only got a few glimpses of her, and yet when she was talking throughout this episode, I thought it looked very, very good, and it looked like they put a good amount of money into making Taweret look believable, and I really appreciated that. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the actual episode, which is of course the story of Marc Spector. And as I say that, I'm getting chills because, to be honest, this episode was so good, specifically because of how you see Steven discovering more and more of the story of Marc and his own existence, what that nature of his existence actually is. And I thought this was so well done. I mean, we start with Taweret explaining exactly what they have to do, which is to balance the scales. We should see a few scenes from the show, and then we get right into the real story, how Marc lived his life. And that was, to begin with, the people that he killed, right? Who was it that he killed? And it was bad people. He didn't just go around killing anyone and everyone. And I appreciated that confirmation here because it was something that we really needed to know, because all we knew was that he was a mercenary for hire. But it seems more like he had essentially one job as a mercenary, and that was this whole thing with his former, I believe it was his former CO or something, and then the CO like essentially lied or tricked him and ended up going back on the word, trying to leave no survivors, and Marc almost died saving the people, but he wasn't able to help them in the end. And I really appreciated this, but before we get to that specific portion of the story, we do end up seeing how Marc's brother died and how that impacted his childhood, causing the creation of Stephen Grant. This honestly was super emotional and so well acted, to the point where it's like, Marc and Steven do not feel like the same person. It doesn't feel like the same person playing two different roles. I mean, Oscar Isaac did a phenomenal job with this, and I am so grateful because, like, I feel like there are probably not many people that could do such a good job at this type of a role where you're playing multiple characters that have such drastically different personalities, and at the same time you're having them show such a insane emotional response. I mean, it is it is insane. So props to Oscar Isaac throughout this episode. I thought it was a mind-blowing performance here. It's hard to put into words, but like that final scene that we see with the final memory that Marc and Steven see together, right? And it is when Marc finally shows Steven what actually happened. Oh my God. It was so well acted. So well acted. You see the fear in both of their eyes, and you see that Marc is trying to keep Steven almost innocent in a sense, almost childlike, which is who Steven Grant is. He's essentially a very childlike persona, very optimistic, very whimsical, very open, and Marc is the one that saw what really happened in the world, what happened at home. And Steven was his retreat, was his protection from having to remember and think about what was actually going on. And I just loved that. It was so good to see, and I loved this explanation. I have no idea if this comes from the comics or if this was 100% made by the creators of the show, but to be honest, I just loved it. It was so good. Now, let's talk about the death of Steven Grant. And honestly, this hurt me a little bit. I assumed that the way that this would resolve is Marc and Steven, maybe Steven disappears or because he's no longer needed, and Marc just becomes who he is and has all the memories of Steven and all of that, but it's now one persona, one person in Marc's body, and they're just able to move forward from there. But instead, we get something that I think is pretty devastating, which is Steven dies here. And this is so devastating because Marc and Steven finally reconcile. They finally have a true understanding of one another and where they're coming from, what they've been through, and yet it comes a little too late. Now Steven is gone and Marc is in the field of reeds, so the question is whether or not Marc and Steven are going to reunite before Marc goes back to the real world or like the land of the living, but we have no idea. We don't know at this point if that's actually going to happen or if Steven has now served his purpose. Like, what exactly does that mean for Marc's mind? Are the memories of Steven Grant dying with Steven, or are they still in his head? Because they are technically one person. I honestly have no clue, and I find it very intriguing to see how they're going to play about that in the next episode from now. Going back though, I did forget to mention exactly what I thought of the scene where Marc becomes Khonshu's Moon Knight. And I thought this was very intriguing specifically because of how Steven reacted to it. And it was, first off, he wasn't sure if he should believe Marc in terms of killing all the people around him, whether or not he really didn't do it. But then Marc explained exactly what happened, and then they end up at the temple. Now, in the temple, I would have thought that Steven wouldn't necessarily understand or identify or be okay with Marc saying yes to Khonshu, or he wouldn't really think or make anything of it at all. But instead, Steven thinks and understands what is going on here in a similar way to how I understood it, which is Khonshu was taking advantage of someone who had nothing left. And that's how I see it. I mean, when you have no other options, when you feel like there's nothing left to do, and one opportunity comes into your view, even though it might be horrible or might not be the best, it is your only option at that point. So you are, in a sense, still being exploited because you have no other choice in the matter. You have to go about it if you want to live, because choosing between life and death is not really a choice for most people. But if you are a person that still sees a potential reason to live, this is no longer a choice, and you are being exploited in this situation in order to choose the only option that you have, and as a byproduct, essentially be the vessel for a god that you know nothing about. You don't know anything about what he's actually going to make you do and what that's going to do to you. So in truth, I mean, Marc was 100% exploited by Khonshu here. Regardless of Khonshu's actual intentions, that is what happened. that is all I have to say for this video. I really love this show, and it's so much more than I would have initially expected, and I'm so happy for that. That being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below about this video. Did you enjoy the episode? Please let me know as well. If you liked the video, please like the video, and as always, subscribe for more videos from me on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye.